scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through the window, and everything seemed normal. Mummy Pig called them down for breakfast, her voice echoing strangely through the house. As they walked down the stairs, Peppa noticed something odd about the family photos on the wall. The faces in the pictures seemed to be watching them, following their every movement with unblinking eyes. In the kitchen, Daddy Pig was sitting at the table reading his newspaper, but when he looked up to greet them, his smile was too wide, stretching impossibly across his face. His eyes had turned completely black, like deep holes in his head. Mummy Pig served them breakfast with jerky, mechanical movements, her head tilting at unnatural angles as she moved around the kitchen. George started crying, but instead of his usual tears, thick black liquid poured from his eyes. Peppa tried to comfort him, but when she touched his shoulder, her hand passed right through him as if he were made of mist. The kitchen began to grow darker, even though the sun was still shining outside. The shadows on the walls started moving on their own, creeping closer to the children. Suddenly, all the toys in the house came to life. Teddy bears with razor-sharp teeth crawled down from the shelves, their button eyes glowing red in the dim light. The toy dinosaur that George loved so much grew to enormous size, its plastic jaws snapping hungrily as it stomped through the living room, leaving deep cracks in the floor with each step. Peppa grabbed George's hand and they ran upstairs, but the house seemed to stretch endlessly. The hallway grew longer and longer, with doors appearing and disappearing along the walls. Behind each door, they could hear whispers calling their names in voices that sounded almost like their friends, but wrong somehow, distorted and hollow. They finally reached their bedroom and slammed the door shut, but when they turned around, the room had changed completely. The walls were covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse and writhe like living things. Their beds had transformed into gaping mouths with rows of sharp teeth, breathing heavily and waiting to swallow them whole. Outside their window, instead of their familiar garden, there was an endless void filled with floating eyes that blinked in unison. The eyes belonged to all their friends from playgroup, but their faces were twisted into expressions of pure terror. Susie Sheep's wool had turned black as coal, and her eyes had become empty sockets that seemed to stare directly into their souls. The children huddled together in the corner as the room began to spin around them. The furniture melted like wax, dripping onto the floor and forming puddles that reflected images of their worst nightmares. In the mirrors, they could see themselves, but their reflections were smiling even though they were terrified, and their reflection selves began to move independently, reaching out from the glass as if trying to pull them in. As the nightmare reached its peak, everything suddenly stopped. The room returned to normal, the sun was shining, and Mummy Pig was calling them for breakfast again. But when Peppa looked at George, she noticed that his reflection in the window was still smiling that terrible smile, even though George himself looked perfectly normal. And in the corner of her eye, she could swear she saw one of the toys move just slightly, as if it were still watching and waiting for the right moment to come alive again. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa and George decided to play hide and seek in their house. The familiar yellow walls seemed different tonight, casting strange shadows that moved without any source of light. Peppa counted to 10 while George ran to find the perfect hiding spot. But when she opened her eyes, something was terribly wrong. The house felt bigger than before, with corridors that stretched endlessly into darkness. Peppa called for George, but her voice echoed back distorted, as if someone else was speaking her words. She walked through the living room where the purple furniture had turned a sickly shade of gray, and the family photos on the walls showed faces she didn't recognize. In the kitchen, Mummy Pig was cooking dinner, but she stood perfectly still, her back turned to Peppa. When Peppa approached and touched her shoulder, Mummy Pig slowly turned around. Her usual warm smile had been replaced by a wide grin that stretched too far across her face, revealing rows of sharp teeth that glinted in the dim light. Peppa ran upstairs to find Daddy Pig reading his newspaper in the bedroom. But as she got closer, she realized he wasn't reading at all. His eyes were completely black, staring at a newspaper with no words, just endless rows of tiny, moving dots that seemed to crawl across the pages like insects. The sound of George crying came from somewhere deep in the house. Peppa followed the sound through rooms that kept changing shape, walls that breathed like living things, and doors that led to places that shouldn't exist. The crying grew louder and more desperate with each step. Finally, she found George in what used to be their playroom, but now it was filled with toys that moved on their own. The red car drove in circles without anyone touching it. The teddy bear's button eyes followed Peppa wherever she went, and the dinosaur toy that George loved so much had grown real teeth and was making hungry, growling sounds. George sat in the corner, but he wasn't crying anymore. He was laughing, a sound that was too deep and too old for a little pig. When he turned to look at Peppa, his eyes had become mirrors, reflecting not Peppa's face, but the face of something else entirely, something that had been waiting in the house all along. The walls began to close in, and Peppa realized that this wasn't her house anymore. It never had been. She had been playing hide and seek, but she was the one who had been found. The real Peppa, the real George, the real family were somewhere else, still looking for the children who had disappeared into a house that existed between the spaces of the real world. As the darkness swallowed everything, the last thing Peppa heard was the sound of her own voice, calling from somewhere far away, still counting to 10, still waiting for a game that would never end. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across the walls. As she walked downstairs for breakfast, she noticed that all the family photos on the wall had changed. In every picture, the faces were smiling, but their eyes were completely black, staring directly at her. George was already sitting at the breakfast table, but he wasn't his usual cheerful self. His pink skin had an odd grayish tint, and when he looked up at Peppa, his smile stretched too wide across his face. Mummy Pig was cooking at the stove, humming a tune that Peppa had never heard before. The melody was haunting and seemed to echo through the house even when Mummy Pig stopped humming. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper, but the pages were completely blank. He turned each empty page with great interest, occasionally chuckling at nothing. When Peppa asked him what was so funny, he looked at her with those same black eyes from the photographs and said in a voice that didn't sound quite right, "Everything is perfectly normal, Peppa. Nothing has changed at all." At school, things became even stranger. All of Peppa's friends were there, but they moved in perfect synchronization, like they were all following the same invisible script. Susie Sheep spoke in monotone sentences, Rebecca Rabbit's ears twitched in an unnatural rhythm, and Pedro Pony's eyes never blinked. The teacher, Madame Gazelle, wrote lessons on the blackboard, but the words kept changing when no one was. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. But something felt different today. The sunlight streaming through their window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across the walls. Peppa noticed that her favorite teddy bear was facing the wrong direction, staring directly at her with its button eyes that seemed to follow her every movement. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her usual cheerful humming had been replaced by an eerie silence. When Peppa entered the kitchen, she saw that Mummy Pig was standing perfectly still, her back turned, stirring porridge that had already turned cold. The spoon moved in endless circles, making a scraping sound against the bottom of the pot that sent chills down Peppa's spine. George tried to speak, but no sound came from his mouth. He pointed frantically at the window, where the familiar garden had transformed into something unrecognizable. The trees had grown impossibly tall overnight, their branches twisted into shapes that resembled grasping fingers reaching toward the house. The playground equipment had vanished, replaced by dark holes in the ground that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. Daddy Pig appeared in the doorway, but his glasses reflected nothing but darkness. His usual jolly smile had been replaced by an expression that Peppa had never seen before. When he spoke, his voice echoed as if coming from a deep well, asking if the children wanted to play a new game. The game, he explained, involved finding all the missing neighbors who had disappeared during the night. As they ventured outside, Peppa realized that their street had become a maze of identical houses, each one slightly wrong in ways she couldn't quite explain. The windows were too large, the doors too small, and every house number was the same. The sky above had turned an unsettling shade of green, and clouds moved in perfect geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. They encountered Susie Sheep standing in the middle of the road, but she wasn't moving or blinking. Her wool had turned gray, and when Peppa called her name, Susie's head turned a full circle to face them while her body remained perfectly still. She spoke in a voice that wasn't her own, warning them that the game had already begun, and there was no way to stop playing until everyone was found. The search led them to the school, where all the desks were arranged in a perfect spiral leading to the center of the classroom. Miss Rabbit was there, writing the same word over and over on the blackboard until it covered every inch of the surface. The word was help, but written backwards, and each letter seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. In the final moments, as darkness began to fall despite it being morning, Peppa realized that they weren't looking for missing neighbors at all. They were the ones who had disappeared, trapped in a world that looked like home but felt like a nightmare. The last thing she saw was her own reflection in a puddle, but the reflection was smiling while she was crying, and it waved goodbye as everything faded to black. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa and George were getting ready for bed in their room. The familiar bunk bed stood in the corner, with George's dinosaur toys scattered on the floor. But tonight, something felt different. The shadows seemed longer, and the toys appeared to be watching them with unblinking eyes. As Mummy Pig tucked them in, she noticed that George's favorite dinosaur toy was missing. "Don't worry," she said with a strange smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure it will turn up." When she left the room, her footsteps echoed strangely in the hallway, as if someone else was walking alongside her. George began to cry softly, pointing at the corner where his toy usually sat. Peppa tried to comfort him, but then she heard it too, a low, rumbling sound coming from somewhere in the house. It sounded like a dinosaur's roar, but deeper, more menacing than any toy could make. The children crept out of their room and tiptoed down the hallway. The house felt enormous in the darkness, with corridors stretching endlessly in directions that shouldn't exist. Family photos on the walls seemed to shift and change when they weren't looking directly at them. They found themselves in the kitchen, but it wasn't quite right. The familiar yellow walls had taken on a sickly green tint, and the refrigerator hummed with an unnatural frequency. Inside the fridge, instead of food, there were rows of identical dinosaur toys, all staring out with glowing red eyes. Daddy Pig appeared in the doorway, but his usual jolly demeanor was gone. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows that moved independently of the clouds outside. As she walked downstairs for breakfast, she noticed that all the family photos on the wall had changed. In every picture, the smiles were just a little too wide, the eyes a little too bright, and everyone was looking directly at her. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen making breakfast, but when she turned around, her face was exactly the same as always, yet somehow completely wrong. Her orange dress was the right color, her smile was in the right place, but there was something hollow behind her eyes, like looking into an empty house through lit windows. Daddy Pig sat at the table reading his newspaper, but the pages were blank. When Peppa pointed this out, he just laughed his usual laugh and said everything was perfectly normal. George was playing with his dinosaur toy, but the toy seemed to be moving on its own, walking across the table in small, jerky steps when no one was touching it. The family decided to visit Grandpa and Grandma Pig, but when they arrived at the familiar house, it looked exactly the same from the outside while being completely different inside. The rooms were in the wrong places, the stairs led to rooms that shouldn't exist, and there were doors that opened onto walls. Grandpa Pig was in his garden, but he was planting flowers that were already fully grown, and when he pulled them from the soil, they had no roots at all. Grandma Pig invited everyone for tea, but the teacups were empty even though she poured steaming liquid into them. The biscuits on the plate kept multiplying when no one was looking, and the clock on the wall was running backwards. When Peppa mentioned these strange things, everyone just smiled and nodded as if everything was perfectly normal. As the day continued, more friends arrived for a playdate. Susie Sheep came over, but she kept forgetting things she had just said, repeating the same sentences over and over. Pedro Pony arrived, but he cast no shadow despite the bright sunlight. Rebecca Rabbit brought her little brother Richard, but Richard never blinked, not even once, and his eyes followed everyone around the room. The children decided to play hide and seek in the house, but every time someone hid, they would disappear completely until the game was over. When it was Peppa's turn to hide, she found a room she had never seen before, filled with toys that looked exactly like all her friends. But the toys were moving and playing by themselves, having conversations in voices that sounded almost right but not quite. As evening approached, the family gathered for dinner, but the food on their plates kept changing when they weren't looking. Peppa would take a bite of carrots, but when she looked down, she was eating something else entirely. The dining room windows showed a view of the garden, but the garden outside was different each time she looked, sometimes showing places she had never been before. When bedtime came, Peppa climbed the stairs to her room, but there were more steps than there should have been. Her bedroom door was the same pink color as always, but when she opened it, the room was much larger than before, stretching back into shadows that seemed to go on forever. Her bed was in the right place, but there were other beds too, identical to hers, lined up in rows disappearing into the darkness. As Peppa lay down to sleep, she could hear voices coming from the other beds, all sounding exactly like her own voice, having conversations she wasn't part of. The voices talked about days she didn't remember living and friends she had never met. Outside her window, the moon was the wrong shape, and the stars were arranged in patterns that spelled out words she couldn't quite read. Just before she fell asleep, Peppa realized that tomorrow would be exactly the same as today, and the day after that would be the same as well. Everything would be perfectly normal and completely wrong, and no one would notice except her. The voices from the other beds grew quieter as she drifted off, but they never stopped completely, whispering stories of all the other Peppas who had discovered this place before her, and all the ones who would come after.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was midnight when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. Something felt wrong. The toys on the floor had moved, and the teddy bear was staring at them with glowing eyes. The room looked different. The yellow walls seemed darker, and the pictures on the walls were watching them. George's dinosaur toy smiled too widely, its plastic eyes gleaming green in the darkness. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside their door. Slow, deliberate steps that didn't belong to Mummy or Daddy Pig. The doorknob turned slowly, and the door creaked open to reveal an empty corridor. But this wasn't their normal hallway. It stretched impossibly long, and the family photos on the walls showed blank, staring eyes instead of smiling faces. The house had changed into something sinister. Peppa and George climbed down from their beds and walked into the corridor. Rooms appeared where they had never been before, and familiar spaces looked completely wrong. The kitchen walls were sickly green, and the refrigerator hummed unnaturally. In the living room, their purple sofa had turned black, and the television showed only static. But in the static, they could see moving shadows that looked like distorted versions of people they knew. The window showed only darkness where their garden should be. Their reflections in the glass moved independently, smiling when they frowned, waving when they stood still. The outside world had simply vanished. Mummy Pig's voice called their names from somewhere in the house, but it echoed strangely, coming from multiple directions at once. When they followed the sound, they found themselves back in the endless hallway. The family portraits began to move. The figures stepped out of their frames one by one, but these weren't their real family. These versions had two wide smiles and eyes that never blinked. Peppa grabbed George's hand as they ran through the corridors, trying to find their room. Every door led to another strange version of a familiar place. The bathroom mirror showed different reflections each time they looked. They found a door that looked like their bedroom, but inside were two other children sleeping in their beds. Children who looked exactly like them, but weren't quite right. The duplicates slept peacefully while the real children watched in horror. The clock on the wall ticked backwards, and with each tick the room grew darker and colder. Whispers from other rooms grew louder, forming words they couldn't understand but somehow knew were meant for them. As the clock reached midnight again, everything stopped. The whispers ceased, the shadows froze, and the house fell silent. Peppa and George found themselves back in their normal beds, in their normal room. When morning came, they tried to tell their parents about the strange night, but nobody else remembered the house being different. The photos showed normal faces, and all rooms were where they belonged. Only Peppa and George knew what happened when the clock strikes midnight. And sometimes, late at night, they still hear those footsteps in the hallway, waiting for the house to change again. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary evening when Peppa and George decided to play hide-and-seek in their house. Mummy Pig was busy cooking dinner downstairs, and Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper in the living room. The children giggled as they ran upstairs to their bedroom, completely unaware that something was terribly wrong with their home tonight. Peppa counted to 10 while George hid behind the purple bunk bed. But when she opened her eyes, the room looked different. The walls seemed taller, stretching endlessly upward, and the cheerful drawings on the walls had changed. Instead of happy elephants and boats, the pictures now showed twisted shapes with too many eyes, all staring directly at her. George peeked out from his hiding spot, but his usual joyful expression was replaced by confusion and fear. The toys scattered across the floor began to move on their own. The wooden train set formed a perfect circle, going round and round with no one controlling it. The teddy bear's button eyes had turned completely black, and its smile had grown wider than it should be possible. Peppa called out for Mummy Pig, but her voice echoed strangely in the room, as if the walls were much further away than they appeared. When she tried to leave the bedroom, the door handle wouldn't turn. It felt cold and wet under her small pink hands, and she could swear she heard something breathing on the other side. The window that usually showed their beautiful garden now revealed a completely different view. Instead of green grass and blue sky, there was only darkness with strange lights moving in patterns that hurt to look at. The lights seemed to be getting closer, pressing against the glass like curious fingers. George started to cry, but his tears weren't the normal kind. They fell upward instead of down, floating toward the ceiling where they formed puddles that reflected images of places that didn't exist. In those reflections, Peppa could see other versions of themselves, but these other Peppas and Georges looked sad and frightened. The purple bunk bed began to grow taller, its ladder extending up and up until it disappeared into shadows above. Peppa realized that their bedroom ceiling had vanished entirely, replaced by an endless dark space filled with whispers in languages she didn't understand. The whispers seemed to know her name, calling to her in voices that sounded almost like Mummy and Daddy Pig, but not quite right. As the night grew deeper, the children discovered that time itself had become strange in their room. Minutes felt like hours, and hours passed like seconds. The clock on the wall spun backward and forward randomly, its hands moving in impossible directions. The most frightening thing was that downstairs, they could still hear the normal sounds of their family. Mummy Pig humming while cooking, Daddy Pig turning newspaper pages. But when they called out, their voices seemed to be absorbed by the walls, never reaching the floors below. Eventually, Peppa and George huddled together on the bottom bunk, watching as their familiar bedroom transformed into something from a dream that wasn't quite a nightmare, but wasn't quite safe either. They fell asleep holding hands, and when morning came, everything was back to normal. But they would never forget that strange night.